Hi, this is Chelsea. I'm going to show you how to gross EMR specimens. So when you get an EMR specimen, it'll come in a container that looks like this. You want to make sure that the pins are in the formalin and the specimen is submerged in the formalin. When you take out your specimen, you'll see that there's all these pins here that help the specimen lay flat. Sometimes you'll get an endoscopic biopsy clip, which you see here. Then you'll want to go ahead and take out the pins. When you're taking out the pins, you want to make sure to hold the mucosa down to the styrofoam, because sometimes when you're pulling out the pins, they can kind of take some of the mucosa with it, because some specimens are more delicate than others, so you want to be careful when you're doing this step. You want to make sure that you're not tearing the radial margin when you take out the pins. When you take the specimen off of the foam, you want to make sure that you take it off delicately and that you're not tearing the radial margin. This one was pretty intact, so it was easy to remove. Here's your radial margin on the outer surface here. Sometimes it kind of sticks up and can be a lighter color like this white shade. On the other surface is your deep margin, so this is the second margin of the specimen. Now we'll flip it back over, and before we get started, we want to take out this biopsy clip. But we want to be delicate with it, because you can see here it's already started to tear the radial margin. So we don't want to tear the margin when we're taking it out. So to take it out, you want to use your forceps and kind of insert it in between the hooks. The hooks are kind of like one of those candy machines that you press the button and it goes down and picks up the candy. So put your forceps in between and just kind of twist it until you're lifting the clip so it loses its grip of the mucosa, and then it should come off pretty cleanly. Once you take off the biopsy clip, you can put it to the side, and you can see that it came off pretty nicely and we didn't tear the radial margin any further. Once you have your biopsy clip removed, it's time to ink the radial margin and the deep margin. We like to use blue for the radial margin and black for the deep margin. We have these nice fine tip inks that come in several different colors, so I like to use them because you can be more accurate and the ink tends to not bleed out. As you're going around, you want to make sure that some of the mucosa hasn't been flipped over to the deep portion. Sometimes when the surgeons are pinning it out, the mucosa can shrink a little bit, and so some of it ends up folding back over. As you can see here, you can see kind of that white raised area that you saw on the other side. So this is actually the radial margin here, so you want to make sure to ink that and not inadvertently ink in the middle of the mucosa where the margin isn't. Once that's done, you can flip your specimen back over and keep inking the remainder of the radial margin. You didn't see me do this in the beginning, but you want to make sure to take a photograph of your specimen and take a photograph while the specimen is pinned to the foam. If any of the mucosa is flipped over onto the deep margin, you also want to take a picture of that. That will actually save you and the pathologist a lot of heartache at the end when you're trying to figure out whether a margin is positive or not. Once you're finished inking the radial margin, you can turn the specimen over and start to work on the deep margin. So for the deep margin, I'm going to use black. On a side note, I just want to say sorry for the background noise. I thought when I was recording my voice over it that it would also record over the background, but as many of you know, I'm not that technically sound, and this is my first video, so maybe the next one I'll figure out how to take out the background noise. So then you just continue to ink the deep margin. Now I know using these smaller ink brushes takes a little bit longer time, but I find that they're more accurate. As I'm inking the specimen, I want to make sure that I get the deep margin of the piece of mucosa that flipped over here. So remember, pull it up with your forceps and ink the deep margin there also. Now that we're done inking, I'll dab off the excess ink, and then I'll put on some acetic acid to help the ink stay. After the acetic acid, I'm ready to now start cutting the specimen, and I want to make sure that I turn it so I'm cutting perpendicular to the long axis. Once I start cutting, we have these tags that say EOE, which is embed on edge, that we put into each of the cassettes, and they look like these little paper tags. When you start cutting the specimens, we cut these at 2 millimeter increments, and this allows for more surface area of the margins to be seen. So you want to hold down the mucosa with one finger and then gently cut and press into the specimen. You don't want to use a sawing action when you're cutting these specimens, because you could tear the radial margins pretty easily, and sometimes you can see here that the edges can fall apart easily, so sawing can tear them up even more. Here I'm pressing in and then kind of doing a rocking motion. So here we put in one cross section into each cassette. Sometimes if they're really long, you can cut them in half or even in thirds. I don't put more than 4 pieces into one cassette, because then the embedders might have a difficult time embedding your specimen, and it's important that they embed them correctly, because when the pathologist gets the slide, you want to make sure that they see the blue from the radial margin on each side as well as the deep margin. Now if they come to you and say, I don't see radial margin in the slide, then you can think, well, maybe histology didn't go deep enough into the block. Now in your gross description, they want us to say which block has the closest radial margin. So you can see here, this polyp is pretty close to the radial margin. So I'm going to say in my gross that whichever cassette I put this strip in, that's going to be my closest radial margin. So you'll continue on like this for the rest of the specimen. Thank you for watching my video. If you have any questions, you can ask myself, Pilar, or Christine to help you if you end up getting one of these specimens in the gross room.